Thank you everyone for joining. There's still some people filtering in now, but we will get going and they can catch up. Not a problem at all. So, welcome everyone to the third webinar in our four-part series, all about how to build and run the world's best B2B webinars. Today, we're going to be talking about all the challenges that a webinar hosts when it comes to the actual content preparation and delivery and the technology setup on the day of the webinar itself, on the day of the live event. So we're going to be providing loads of tips and tricks on how to solve those what those challenges are and how to solve those challenges. Today, myself and Sonia are going to be speaking. So Sonia Schmidt is the Chief Growth Officer at Tevent, which is the platform that we're using to stream this to you right now. So she's got loads of experience with webinars. She's worked in and around the industry for a long time, and she's hosted and run a load of webinars of her own. So she's got loads of experience to share with us. And those that don't know myself, if you haven't come to the first couple of webinars in this series, my name is Tom. I'm the CMO at Atomley, and I've got 4 years of really hands-on experience running webinars, have built and run dozens of webinars over those years, and I've also got 10 years of broader experience in digital sales and marketing as well. So what's the objective? Why have we been running this whole series of webinars? And we'll continue to do so into the final one that's in a couple of weeks' time. Well, we're here to help B2B firms host the world's best webinars that generate customers and increase revenue. And the whole point of the type of webinar that we talk about and that we promote is not to be aggressive in the way that you sell, not to pitch people a product or a service straight off the bat in a webinar, but actually to be helpful and produce useful content and thought leadership. And that's what it's all about for us. And we're going to be kind of teaching you how to do that today. So we break down the kind of webinar process into 3 broad areas. And you would have seen this before if you came to our first couple of events. We break it down into acquisition, delivery, and conversion, or in other words, what to do before the webinar, what to do during the webinar, and what to do after the webinar. And today we're focusing all on that middle section, all about the delivery. So what are you going to do during the webinar to ensure that it's has maximum effectiveness and maximum engagement? And we think that this is an obvious statement, but we think this is the most important stage. So last time we put lots of emphasis on the pre-webinar marketing and how that really needs to be really tight and it needs to work properly. You need to profile the right people, get the right audience in the room. But really, the most important part of running a webinar is the webinar content itself and making sure that it all goes smoothly on the day. So that's exactly what we're going to be tackling today and helping you with. And that's broken down into 3 further substages. And what I'm going to do today is talk you through the kind of pitfalls and the challenges of each of these 3 areas and the solutions to those problems. So first of all, we're going to be looking at the content itself. Secondly, we're going to look at the logistics. And finally, we're going to look at the qualification, which is something that people typically miss out when they're doing webinars, and we think is also very, very important. So first of all, the content. And this really is the most time-consuming part of the whole webinar process, from the first day of preparation all the way through to the last day of the sales process. The most time-consuming piece is putting the content together. So these are some of the challenges that we hear from the industry when people are talking about content delivery, specifically within webinars. So the first one is that webinars are all about what the host wants. This is a common issue or comment that we get. It's usually because webinars are hosted by a member of sales. Sales is there to sell stuff. And so the pitch becomes a sales pitch. And they're just broadcasting their pitch rather than doing it one-to-one. They're just broadcasting it to multiple people at the same time. And this means that there's very little audience value. So we're going to be talking about how to kind of resolve that in a minute. Another problem that kind of drills down further from there is that the content doesn't solve the pain point of the audience. So, if you're focusing on selling something, then you're not really focusing on the audience's pain points. You've got an ulterior motive. So we're going to talk about how to make sure that you're really tackling the pain points that the audience will have and how to discover what those are. A third problem that we find is that the host isn't passionate or knowledgeable about the topic that they're talking about. In other words, it's boring. So there's the quote that's on the screen here from Maya Angelou. And I think this really encapsulates this. It's all about how you make people feel. And if you can bring passion to the delivery and the content that you put up on the screen and that you're talking to people about, then it's going to encourage that strong positive emotion. And then people are going to remember what you did, and that potentially will come back in the future and also tell other people all about it as well. And that's exactly what we want. Another problem that we find is that the delivery isn't structured or clear. So, there's no clear segmentation between the slides, and basically people just get lost in the visual representation and in the verbal delivery. And the most common issue within that is that people just try to put too much on the screen. And I'm going to talk about how to kind of clean up your presentation, if you like, to make it as clear as possible in a minute. But more stuff on the screen does not equal more value. That's a misconception. And it's much more about simplification than it is about cramming much more into the screen. So how do we tackle all of those problems that I just mentioned? What does good look like for good content in a webinar? Well, first of all, minimalizing what's on screen. So, ensuring that there's clarity and structure through the use of signposting and segmentation. So breaking the content down, just like I've done, into 3 sections and then 3 subsections, so everyone knows exactly where you are. Using more imagery and less words is really important. So, for example, you'll see throughout this presentation, we use very sort of clean lines and clean images. And then I put the verbal over the top of that to give you the gist of what's going on. The image isn't supposed to tell the whole story. And then putting yourself into the audience's shoes. So looking at it as if it was the first time that you've ever looked at the presentation will help you understand whether it's too busy or if it doesn't make sense or the structure is a little bit lost and confused. So we find a great exercise is to go and find someone outside of your business, deliver the presentation to them before you run the webinar, get their feedback, get them to be brutally honest with you about that, and then get their help to help you structure and organize the flow of your presentation and the cleanliness and the clarity of what's on screen. So in order to improve content, besides the clarity and the signposting of the presentation itself, what other things can we do? Well, last time we spoke about there's 2 key elements to preparing the world's best webinar. Well, actually, we went back to the drawing board and we decided that there's 3. And those 3 are increasing audience value, increasing remarkability, and increasing relatability. And if all of the content that you deliver is improving at least one of those 3 things, preferably more than one of those 3 things, then you've got a really good formula for great content. So how do you inject audience value, remarkability, and relatability into your content? Well, first of all, understanding the audience's pain points, like I discussed a minute ago, is really important. So interviewing your audience, that could be your existing customers, your prospective customers, and getting to understand what their pain points are. And then selecting the most important of those. If those were ranked from 1 to 5, select the 3 most important and solve for those. So be very direct in the way that you solve the problems that your customers have directly told you that are a challenge for them. Another really important element to bring value and remarkability is to bring a guest speaker. So today we have Sonia. She's going to be talking to myself in about 10 minutes or so. And in the research that we've done, we find that people want more case studies. They want a knowledgeable and professional guest speaker that can come in and help answer the questions that nobody else can answer and help teach the key takeaways that nobody else can teach. So who makes a good guest speaker? What should you be looking out for when you're trying to find a guest speaker? Well, first of all, you could find someone that wrote the book on the topic, and often an author of a book or an ebook will be looking to promote their research or promote their book for sale. So it's an easy way to get a good guest that knows their stuff onto the webinar. Secondly, we could go to someone who teaches the topic. So it could be a lecturer if it's an academic topic. It could be a coach or a mentor or just an industry expert with lots of experience. And again, they could be cross-promoting some of their own content as well. And finally, someone who is an existing customer or an existing prospect is always going to be a great guest, because at the end of the day, they have been through the challenges that you are talking about. And so they'll be able to add some flavor, and hopefully they'll also be able to promote you and what you do as a supplier if they've had a good experience with you and they're willing to come on and be a guest, then they probably got some good things to say about you as well, which is always nice. And then finally, in terms of improving relevancy, it sounds obvious, but focusing on your specialist subject is going to bring that natural passion and depth to the content that you need in order to solve people's problems and make it interesting. The only thing that you need to make sure that you do here is qualifying why you're the expert. Why do you have the credibility? Why should people listen to you? So you'll notice when we started the presentation, I said that I've got 4 years of experience and 10 years of broader experience. Sonia's been doing it for many years as well. So we're giving that credibility to why we think we have the authority to be able to speak on this topic, which is really important. Okay, so the second area to look at when it comes to delivering a great webinar is the logistics. So this is actually getting it to run in a live setting on time, all the technology works properly. And this is often a scary bit for people. And the first problem that we hear really often is that people are scared of doing it wrong while it's live and looking foolish. And the obvious answer to this is anyone can do it. You just need the right training and the right processes in place. So we're going to cover what some of those processes look like in a second, so that you don't end up looking silly. If you don't get the reference on screen, go and check out the episode of Only Fools and Horses. Very funny, one of my favorite episodes. But we don't want to be having an issue like that. So getting everything clean and well organized is really important. Another misconception is that everything needs to be automated and perfectly set up before you can start. People get paralyzed by this sort of inaction. They're worried that something's going to go wrong. They're worried that everything's not quite set up perfectly, and they end up just delaying the webinar indefinitely. You don't need things to be perfect in order to be successful. People often don't know which platforms to use. So there are 4 big names on the screen that everyone will have heard of before. Actually, when people ask me about webinars, this is the most common question that I hear is, which webinar platform should you use? Honestly, there isn't a right answer to that question, and I'll expand on what I mean by that in a minute. And the final issue when it comes to logistics is people are worried that the webinar might be too long, or they've chosen the wrong format, and the audience will drop off too early, and you won't be able to get your message across on time. And that is important because the average attention span is reducing all the time. So gauging what an appropriate length of webinar and content delivery looks like is really important, and making sure that people stay to the end. So again, what does good look like when it comes to the logistics of a webinar? Well, the first thing to say is that imperfections are what make us human. So I will make multiple mistakes during the delivery of this webinar. I know that there may be some glitches and issues with the software, hopefully not, but it always, these things happen. It's always a threat. It might happen. So the thing to say really is that, well, that's okay, right? You can't win the lottery unless you buy a ticket. And at the same time, if something does go wrong, it enables you to build trust and rapport with your audience, because you can have some humility about the fact that something went wrong. And it's actually a way to build engagement with people. So don't be afraid of getting out there and giving it a try. The first time I did a webinar, I was terrified. I've done lots of them now, and I'm still anxious when, in the 10 minutes running up to this, I was still anxious, but you get used to it and you have to get out there and try it. So don't buy a ticket. You're not going to win. You have to get involved and give it a try. Something that's going to prevent things from going wrong, though, is having a tech team in the back end. So Charlie is going to be buzzing around in the background today, getting everything sorted so that I can focus on doing this, which is delivering the content to you. Charlie is great. Thank you again, Charlie, for all of your help across this whole series. He will be doing things like managing the polls, managing the questions and the responses to the questions in the chat, making sure that the screen sharing is working on a separate device, as say he's viewing it from an audience's point of view to make sure nothing's going wrong. And he's actually feeding that back to me in a WhatsApp chat that's just off to the side here, which is in my field of view. So if anything does go wrong, I know exactly what's happened and Charlie can feed that back to me. So having someone on hand is great. And really, it can be anyone in your business. As long as you rehearse, anyone in your business can play that role. Charlie's very good at it. We've done it multiple times together now, which is fab. But you can draft someone in to do that for you if you're worried about something going wrong. When it comes to choosing your platform, there are loads of really good low-cost webinar platforms out there. We use Tevent. One of the this isn't a joke. One of the reasons why we chose Tevent originally is because it's purple and all of the rest of them are blue. And I hate what I call corporate blue logos, right? Because you can tell immediately that they're designed for enterprise, they're designed for the tech world. And honestly, when we've used Zoom and GoToWebinar and tools like that in the past, you don't get the same level of treatment from the supplier. We've got a good relationship with Tevent. They give us great support. They've got all the features that we need. So we highly recommend Tevent, and it's also cheaper than most of the other tools out there as well, which is always great. But really, it doesn't matter what tool you use, as long as you're comfortable with it and it has all of the features and functionality that you need to run a good webinar. And we're going to cover what those sort of checklist of features should be later. As long as it has all of those things, you'll be absolutely fine. And it doesn't really matter which tool you choose. It's much more about the process that you put underneath that tool to make sure everything runs smoothly. One big no-no to that, sort of addendum to that, though, is not to use a video conferencing solution. So all of these tools actually have a webinar function, but if you're setting up a meeting or a video conference, then that's the wrong type of solution to be using. So what I mean by that is anything where the audience can unmute themselves, come on the camera, and sort of disrupt the broadcast, if you like. That is a meeting solution rather than a webinar webcasting solution. So you just need to make sure that you choose the right one. And all of these solutions will have a webinar specific product or module that you can use. So if you're already on those stacks, just make sure you're using the right module for those. In terms of the format and the structure, we want to try and combat this issue of hour-long webinars, because if you run a webinar for an hour, and you run right up to the end, people have got another meeting to run to. They don't absorb the message and they're already off to their next meeting as soon as that finishes. So we say keep it under an hour. We've got a 45-minute formula, which is exactly what we're using today. I'm already at risk of running over the first bit. So what we say is 20 minutes for the thought leadership, 10 minutes for the guest interview with Sonia today, for example, 10 minutes for audience Q&A, so that's general questions, and 5 minutes for buffer. So on that note, if you've got any questions as we go through this, please do put them into the questions on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll come around to answering those later. But we find that this structure, this 45-minute formula, really works, and it keeps people engaged. It stops people from dropping off because they've got a meeting to attend right at the end. And that buffer, that 5-minute buffer, really helps because inevitably, you're going to run over a little bit. Or there'll be an interesting question that comes in right at the end that you really want to answer. So just adding that buffer is really important. Starting and finishing on time, also important. So you'll notice today that I started at 3 o'clock. Hugh and I, we talk about this often, but we say, look, if people are turning up on time, then you shouldn't be punishing those people. So if you start at 5 minutes past, you're actually punishing the people that came on time. And helping the people that turn up late. We want to flip that on its head. You start on the dot at the time that you said that you're going to start. You're not punishing anyone by doing that. People can catch up if they join a few minutes late. It's not a problem. First few minutes is usually introductions and things anyway, so they're not going to miss much. It's just really important to keep within the boundaries of the time that you set originally and staying true to that. And then the final thing, again, it's an obvious thing to say, but there's some sort of tips in here for you, is rehearsal. People don't like to practice and rehearse things. I'm not really one for rehearsing. But there are methods and ways to do this to make sure that you stick to your time, that your content's good and well delivered. And so what I do, for the last couple of days, I've just been timing myself with a stopwatch on my phone, running through the content, making some minor tweaks and amends, and just making sure that it all flows properly and that it all fits in the time that we've said. Some people like to practice in front of a mirror, or there's loads of different methods for this, but I don't personally think that really helps me. But whatever works for you is what you should be doing. And as long as you're comfortable going into it, that you know the content and you know how to deliver it, then it's absolutely fine. So I said 20 minutes, it's 20 past. I'm going to get through this bit and then we're going to move on to the interview. This is what the buffer's for. So real-time qualification, super important part of the process. This is the third sub-stage of delivery. And this is something that people don't do at the moment. And our whole mission really at Atomley is to talk to people about this. This is the purpose of running lead gen webinars, is to get qualified leads out the back end of it. So this section is going to be all around that. And the problem statements that we hear are this issue of, well, people think that a registration for a webinar, so when you click on LinkedIn that you're going to attend, or when you register on a form on a website, that is a lead. Actually, if you follow through this funnel, very basic funnel on the right hand side of the page here, from prospect down to deal, there are 3 terms in the middle of that funnel that have the word lead in it. So you've got lead, marketing qualified lead, and sales qualified lead. So when you say a registration is a lead, what type of lead are we talking about? So having a taxonomy is really important. And I'm going to tell you exactly what taxonomy we use in a minute. People also don't define success, and they don't have a way to measure success either. So if you don't have a taxonomy and you don't have a goal in mind, then how are you going to measure, and how are you going to understand whether this was a successful webinar or not? So when your boss asks you, say, how many leads did that campaign or that webinar generate, you need to have a 30-second response. It's a number and whether that was good or bad. If you then get into a half-an-hour conversation about, well, what is a lead and what does it mean and what was good and what was bad, then you haven't done a good job of setting that in the ground before you get going. So we're going to talk about that in a second as well, about how to actually do that in the best way possible. Like I said earlier, people don't survey attendees. 80% of all webinars that were run in 2021 did not survey their attendees. And we also find that when people do survey their attendees, they're only getting a 16% response rate, which is pretty poor. So we're here to try and improve that and upgrade that statistic over time. And the built-in tools that you can use as part of the webinar platform that ask for feedback after the event are not good enough to get real qualification intent data, which is what we're all about. So again, what does good look like? So in terms of defining the leads, so what we like to do is have a really clear understanding of what each of our lead statuses, each of these stages of the funnel actually means. So in our definition, a prospect is someone who meets ICP, they're on the target list of people that we want to invite, and they've already been invited. A lead, second stage, is someone who registers for the event. So that's very specifically what I was talking about a minute ago. A registrant is just a regular lead in our language. An MQL, marketing qualified lead, is someone who attends the event for at least 15 minutes because they have to attend for a minimum amount of time to be able to absorb the basic message. Then we've inserted our own term, which is an Atomley qualified lead. So this is someone that attends the event, fills in the Atomley survey, which I'll talk about in a minute, and exhibits a positive intent. So they have good feedback about the webinar. So that's, in our mind, a much better qualification than a standard marketing qualified lead. A sales qualified lead is someone who engages in a conversation after the webinar. So they've requested a follow-up and they've had that follow-up call with a member of sales. So they're sales qualified. And then a deal is where the commercial conversation carries on from there. And it may not be with the person that came to the webinar. It might be with someone on that person's team or their boss. So the decision maker is what creates a deal. So we encourage you to do the same. We can share this taxonomy with you. If you send me an email, we can share it with you. And we encourage you to do exactly the same, really clearly define what those statuses are. And in terms of surveying people and understanding their intent, there's a great quote here from Kerry Cunningham from Forrester. He says, take advantage of every form of intent data you possibly can to understand who is in market. And that's exactly what we do with the surveys that we run in our webinars. So going back to that engagement, if an engaged person is attending the event, then you need to leverage that engagement and turn that into an opportunity to collect data from them, right? So doing exactly what Kerry was saying from Forrester, if you've got the opportunity, you need to take that chance to get the information out of people. And the way that we do it, we find the best way to do it is to survey people during the webinar. So I'm not talking about polling, which is what Charlie's been activating throughout this, and please do fill in the polls. I'm not just talking about that, I'm talking about actually surveying them and getting their intent from them before they exit, because when people exit the webinar, they're already on to the next meeting. So a good response rate is 10 to 20%. GoToWebinar said last year 16% was their average. We get 70 plus. We've actually seen higher than that in the past, 70+% response rates to the surveys that we run. And the way that we do that is by running it during the event, but we're also doing some good at the same time. So we donate money to charity, or in this case, we prefer to choose a specific charity. So we chose Magic Breakfast. So in our case, every time someone fills in the survey, we give one donation, one breakfast to the charity. That enables them to feed a school child that's going into school hungry because they're from an underprivileged background and therefore not able to learn properly because they're hungry at school, so they can't learn properly. So we choose that charity. Every time someone fills in one of the surveys in our webinars, we donate one breakfast to Magic Breakfast. But actually, you can choose any charity you want, any value of donation, any type of donation you want. And that is a win-win-win. It's a win for the charity, obviously, because they're getting donations. It's a win for the host because we get some information about the audience and some feedback from the audience. But it's actually also a win for the audience member because they can feel good about the fact that they've given some mutual exchange back to the host and they've donated to charity, and they didn't have to put their hand in their own pocket to do that at all. So that's how we deliver content during a webinar. Hopefully that was useful. I've talked enough now, so I'm going to move across to the interview with Sonia. So Sonia, if you'd like to come up onto the stage as well, please do. In the meantime, guys, please do put your questions in the Q&A bar on the right-hand side. Encourage you to put those in, and Sonia and I will be tackling those in just a minute. And also, I'm going to release the screen sharing so that Charlie can do his bit as well. And we're going to put the Atomley thermometer up on the screen. So we would encourage you to fill in the survey using the QR code on the screen. And we're going to donate on your behalf to charity every time somebody does that. Sonia, how are you?
Oh.
How's it going?
Yeah, I'm very good. Thank you. That was such a great presentation. Super insightful.
Thank you. It overran by a few minutes, but that's what the buffer's for. So, we spoke about that, so it's fine, I think.
Absolutely.
Good. So thanks so much for joining. I know that you're currently in Spain, which is what the funky background there is all about. It's great to have you on. Obviously, you're the Chief Growth Officer at Tevent, which is the platform that we're using right now to stream this. And you've hosted and managed loads of events throughout the course of your career. So can you just tell us a little bit about your history, and then also about what kind of worked for you in the past and what didn't, and any best practices that you can share that might add to the content that I just delivered?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you said, I am Chief Growth Officer at a company that runs webinars. That is a webinar platform. So I hope that I do know a thing or two about good webinars. But other than that, in my previous life, I had a lot to do with webinars as well. So I was a consultant at a company called Overtly Consulting. You probably know Overtly. They also have a consulting arm. They're an advertising house originally. And we ran a thought leadership content series called Conversations That Matter. Now, that was really early in the days, and I do think that consulting firms have kind of pioneered the webinar channel as a B2B kind of like lead generation tool. Which was really interesting, actually. So I was on the team that helped coordinate that, and I was there for just under 3 years, so quite a bit of time. And then obviously now I'm at Tevent. I wish I could take all the credit for it, but I can't. I have a brilliant team under me in growth and marketing as well, and we've ran this interview series called Tevent Talks. I don't want to say it's a webinar, but it's like in a webinar format. But we wanted to make it a little bit more interactive and interesting. So it's an interview series. And the theme was to uncover the human behind the business, right? And obviously the intention was to attract people to the platform, users, and then eventually convert them as well in terms of users for webinars that they use the tool as well. So it was a B2B format for us. Now, there were different sections in your questions. I'm going to address it one by one. You've asked me what formats do work. So as I just mentioned, the Event Talks format was very, very organic intentionally. I think we're going to get into like how to prepare good content a little bit later, but we left it quite open, and we made sure that the host also had a relationship to the guest. So there's a real synergy on screen, and we kind of pre-prepared a few questions so we knew what was coming. So it wasn't quite just like, 100% freestyle, but it needed to be organic. It needed to seem like a conversation, almost like a podcast, and that works for webinars as well. On the flip side of that, I do think it needs to be very structured. It might seem like what I'm saying is like opposite right now, but it's not. You can have a very structured conversation, right? And visuals really help with that as well. I think you've touched upon that in your content. So definitely second that. And best practices. Now we're getting into the juicy bit. We all know Zoom fatigue. We've been through 2 years of a pandemic. There's a lot of behavioral science, so I've done a bit on that at Overtly Consulting as well, behind what screens do to you. So it is really, really crucial now, especially with physical events coming back, to engage your audience, right? So you can't just like talk at the audience. And I think Atomley and you guys at Atomley Fusion do that really, really well with the polls, with the survey. I see 34 children fed already. That's amazing. So things like that is really, really important, and not just like engage the audience. So when I did the Ogilvy thought leadership series, Conversations That Matter, the host at the time, Dejuan, always at the beginning asked, okay, where are you tuning in from and what's the weather like? And I thought that was a really nice way of starting off with the audience. But polls and Q&A are a nice way to engage with the content itself. So it's not just about just like, senseless engagement, which is nice, but also make them engage with the content.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a kind of sliding scale between highly involved, very collaborative, very discussion based, what we would call a round table type webinar, and then there's the kind of broadcasted monologue piece exclusively, or monologue with a Q&A at the end, which is what we do. And there's a real sliding scale in between those, right? So obviously you guys were doing like an interview that people were watching and then asking questions, which is very much like this segment that we're going to be doing over the next 10-15 minutes. So I think it's really important, like you say, regardless of where you are on that scale, to incorporate the audience in some way, and by polling, by surveys, and by enabling them to ask questions and put comments in the chat, that really gets people around the table and a virtual table and talking with you. And it's, exactly, it's super important to get the audience engagement. And actually, I did a podcast, the first ever Atomley podcast, which, Charlie, if you can post in the chat, that would be great. We recorded that last week with a communications expert called Kim Page. And she had loads of great things to say about how to engage with the audience and do proper research about who your audience is and why they're here and all that kind of stuff. So have a look at that. It's on YouTube. Check it out as well. Awesome. Okay, thanks, Sonia. So in terms of the whole kind of content preparation, not just for event talks as a format, but in general, what would you say is a good content preparation process, or what process have you followed in the past to make sure that you tick off all of the kind of basic things that need to be done before you get going and hit go on a live webinar?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you said in your segment, it's probably the most onerous part of the process in terms of time. And I think people underestimate that in general, how many hours actually go into a webinar in terms of preparation, especially if you have a guest, because you do need to make sure you're aligned, that your content matches, that you know when, if it's an interview like this or a panel discussion, when to hand off, etc. So I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly, about like how to craft your content, and then maybe a little bit about the process. So I think you've touched upon it, and I think it's worth me just reiterating how important it is to make your content relevant to your audience. It's a little bit like anything in sales. You can't just like blanket a message out and be like, please buy our product, right? Because there's going to be different pain points, different value propositions, different needs fulfilled depending on the audience. And it's kind of the same in thought leadership and B2B webinars. You have webinar series or you also have like piecemeal webinars. So yours this time around, it's a series, and Event Talks, for example, is a series. You will build your audience over time, and then you really learn who is coming to join and what their titles are, which companies they're from, so which segment target segment they are. Or if it's just a standalone webinar, you could just look at the registration and find out a little bit more. And what I say is there's always time to adapt content. So if you see that, for example, there's only registrants from a certain category or industry, for example, retail, and you prepared something on, I don't know, sports, then you kind of adapt your examples, for example. So that is one thing. Really personalize, understand your audience beforehand, and adapt if need be. Now, intent, you mentioned it in the Forrester slide. It's really, really important to understand the intent behind the attendance, okay? And for me, in terms of webinars, but like if we broaden it out a little bit to like digital content, there's only a few reasons people join, really. One is educational, okay? People want to learn more, and that's where the thought leadership value lies. But obviously, what we want to do as B2B salespeople is to convert these interested people afterwards, right? So the other one would be networking and recruitment. Now, this is a big one because that's where we saw a lot. Basically, the physical events were very much around networking, a lot about selling as well, but very much about networking. And that kind of then spilled into the digital world, especially during the pandemic. But then you also have the recruitment side. So at overtly, that's one we saw a lot. So and all the consulting ones, a lot of people that join want to get a job at that firm. So you kind of need to filter them out, but also understand the intent. And then there's entertainment, which is great. Like a lot of people love to be entertained. And that's why I think it's always nice to sprinkle a little bit in, even if it's like a very serious B2B webinar. So I don't know if you've ever done one of these like very big corporation like the HR trainings or any kind of safety training, and you need to watch those videos for a very long time. So my comparison is kind of like, would you rather watch that or listen to a podcast? And I think we know what the answer is. It's a podcast. So make it fun, right? But basically my point with all that is there is an intent behind people joining your webinar. Make sure you capitalize on that intent, because you're not going to engage your audience if you don't understand the intent. If you understand the intent, you can fulfill that need, as you said, solve the pain point, but then also convert after that.
Absolutely, yeah. In a lot of ways, you can also kind of drive the intent on behalf of the audience, right? Because if you put something on your registration page that says this event is for X type of people looking to do Y outcome, then the people that are going to subscribe or the register for that are more likely to be those sorts of people, right? So you can kind of massage the intent that you want in the audience to actually be there. But like you say, you can never cater for the fact that, and this is great, that you have inbound leads that they're not people that you're targeting specifically, but they're coming on the webinar for some other purpose. And like you say, trying to round it off too much and cater for everyone might not necessarily work. So you need to kind of stick to your original intent. But if you see that people are loads and loads and loads of people are registering from a completely different industry, then you probably do want to pivot your content a little bit. I think we had a little bit of that because we had some questions coming in through the registration process, and we actually decided to change a few slides and change the way that our content was managed. So yeah, looking at that and making sure that you cater for that is super important. So it would be kind of remiss of me not to talk about the technology, right? Because obviously you are the CGO of a webinar streaming platform, and a very good one at that. So from my point of view, it would be really interesting to understand from a supplier's perspective to the marketplace, what are the key features or things that really need to be part of the webinar platform that you're using? And what are the things that if they're not there, you're really going to miss them when it comes to that go live time? And maybe some like nice to have stuff as well, because there's lots of features out there that the various different platforms have, but it's good to understand what's the nice to haves and what's the sort of business critical ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the compliments, by the way. So I think one of the things that we do at Event that I haven't seen in anywhere else to that extent, at least in my career, is we really, really listen to customers and prospects and determine our offering and tweak our offering and our features based on that. So I'm really coming to you today with more than a year's worth of conversations to users. And, Niall, Customer Success Associate, is doing a great job at that. We've spoken to you a lot as well and listened to your requirements. So I've sifted all this down, right? And I'm going to try to give you the 3 key ones that I think are, and the market thinks are the most important ones, and then a couple of nice to haves. And I think it's still important to have some nice to haves because that's how you differentiate on the market, right? So key number one, without a doubt, I would say analytics. In general, especially in a B2B context, you want to make sure that you know who's attending, exactly who. So that means company, industry, role, etc. But then also get the contact details to follow up, email, phone number, etc. So analytics, who's attending, but also when are they attending, what did they do, as much as possible data, where are they tuning in from. So that is super, super important. Now, then you also have intent data. So that's what we get from things like the polls and the Q&A, but being able to process that in a very easy way afterwards is critical. So following up with your audience is critical, as you know, and you guys are doing that really, really well. So that intent data will help you to follow up and will help you determine with what message. Something else very important, and that's more for the organizer rather than the attendee, is the setup experience, right? So making sure that it's quite easy to set up a webinar and also manage it, manage the attendees, manage the time, manage reminders, manage branding, because a lot of it is about branding, especially B2B. You want to be able to customize. That's really, really important. And then engagement features. So I did mention polls a little bit in the analytics, but the flip side is really engaging the audience. On some, we have a feature on Event where we have bigger reactions. So that's maybe for more, how do you say, like fun webinars rather than very kind of more corporate B2B, although I know you guys are doing a healthy mix. It's important to be able to cater to each of these, because it might be that one suits a need and the other one, has a different need, a customer, I mean. So reactions are one that we use, but then we also have polls, Q&A. We have a social element to event. I think that's quite important as well. So the audience can network amongst themselves. So I don't know if you guys can see that, but there's bubbles. You can click on a contact card. Now we're getting to the nice to haves, because I had that as a nice to have. And I think there's a line somewhere, because I do think networking is important amongst attendees. As we said, that's one of the intents. But then there's a community element. So it's a nice to have. Event, for example, has something called spaces. So you could create a community on the back of a webinar or an event. And then there's the third point. Sorry, I've been talking a lot, I realize. The third point is, like, I don't know if you guys have seen, but there's different more gimmicky platforms like Gather or Spatial Chats. Basically, you have like bubbles with pictures and they move around. Something that feels a little bit more like 4D or 3D. Any dimension, more dimensions. And that is nice to have. I think the jury is still out on whether that really increases engagement or not. I think there needs to be quite a nice flow in the screen and the arrangement, but I'm not sure that moving around in a Pokemon type environment really helps. So jury's still out on that. It's a nice to have.
Yeah, I agree. I think on the first webinar, I did a quick screen share of Lemverse, which is like a virtual sort of space in which you have a little character and you can move around and talk to people. It's almost like a video game. I agree. I think some of these things, like you say, the jury's still out on whether they actually add genuine intent, engagement. Do these features actually help push forward the message that you want, or do they distract from that? But I think what you guys are doing with the spaces is really important, because when you register, like when you guys in the audience have registered for this, you will be naturally in a space, which is what the webinar is inside. So the webinar is contained within a space, and then within that space, you can talk to other people that also attended the event. You can run other types of events. Say, you can choose to run a webinar or a roundtable or a one-to-one meeting or whatever type of meeting or event you want. So having that community element, I think, has been a consistent thread throughout all of the conversations that we've had, is that drive towards community before and after the event itself is going to be super important. And that brings me on actually to the question that I've been asking everyone, which is, where do you think the industry is going next? Or where would you like to see it go next off the back of those features that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really exciting time for this channel, which is webinars, B2B webinars for lead generation. Is super exciting. I think one of the reasons is at the frenzy of the pandemic has cooled, but webinars didn't die. So that's great. However, some companies took a hit. I'm not going to say which ones, but it isn't dead. So maybe hybrid is coming back, but as a channel, it becomes more important, maybe more so for some segments than others. And I think a driving factor for that is an crazy increase in advertising costs. So the advertising, capturing customers and consumers' attention is becoming increasingly difficult. The market out there is crazy saturated. More companies have more means. Obviously to the benefit of digital advertisers like Google and Facebook. But that also means that, customers are completely saturated. So being able to engage so personally and so directly on content with an audience, that is invaluable. And that's why I think webinars will keep growing. I think, Atomley Fusion is doing something really great in helping companies achieve those goals, because it's not straightforward. So I do think there's going to be more tools out there to help companies achieve those goals. There's going to be more companies like yours, or yours will grow as well, to help achieve that, to really grow your business and your lead list through webinars. So I think it's a massive industry and there's loads of potential.
Yeah, absolutely. There's more and more alternative solutions coming out all the time. Dozens of them have been released over the last couple of years. And like you say, to stand out in that marketplace as a supplier, you need to differentiate yourself. But also, there's obviously a drive towards people wanting to do more of them, because otherwise there wouldn't be these new solutions coming out. And relatively speaking, it is a low customer acquisition cost. Put someone through a webinar funnel versus paid ads where you have to top so many people into the funnel, and you have to produce all of this content, and you have to do so much activity to sort of get the engine cranked up and turning over. Whereas a webinar is something that, with a small team of people and an expert point of view, an expert opinion, you can really get out there and acquire business. So it's 100%. It's something that will continue to evolve, and I think hybrid is probably the way that it's going to go now that people are going back to in-person events as well. So we're a few minutes over. If people have got meetings, please do feel free to drop off. If you can do the survey on the way out of the virtual door, that would be great, so that we've got some feedback. If you're okay, Sonia, stay on for a few more minutes. This is why we suggest 45 minutes, because people usually are quite happy to stay up to the hour if they are enjoying the content, which hopefully everyone is. So I'm just going to come around to some of the questions in the chat. So the top voted one in the chat is, how do I engage the audience and offer value without being taken off-piste by less relevant questions? There was a chance that I was going to mispronounce one of the words in there, but I didn't, thankfully. So Sonia, do you want to take that one first? How do you make sure that you answer the right questions, and that you're kind of, like you say, following the intent of the general audience rather than an outlier that's joined?
Yeah, I'm trying to find the question, but I think fine. So the question is, sorry, how do you answer the right question for the audience, and you make sure that you don't deviate from the content too much?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I think, in general, the content you plan is also targeted towards the audience that you plan on having, and kind of 80% of the time that works out, because you end up putting money towards those segments and targeting those segments on different platforms, and often it also comes from a mailing list. Now with more interactive content, for example, I'll do one tomorrow where there will be less of the upfront presentation like you did, the thought leadership, but it's more of a discussion. question. I think with those, if you need to adapt along the way, it's easier. So as we said, like if it's an organic conversation like we had here, although like we did talk about it a little bit, we can really see, depending on the questions, depending on the audience, what people are after, and then kind of like adapt along the way. Of course, that's a skill. But hopefully people who present webinars and host them do have it.
Yeah, exactly. I think I would second all of that. I think if it warrants going down the rabbit hole a little bit, and that you think that there will be general value to the whole audience, not just the individual that's asked the question, then I think it's worth taking a detour for a couple of minutes. But generally speaking, like Sonia said, if you put down the guardrails and your presentation, your webinar is going to be about this topic, if people are going off left and right from that, then it might be better to just engage with them offline afterwards. So just like Sonia said, if you've got a platform where you can download all of the questions that were asked by who, at what time, whether they were answered or not, that data is super important. And what we do typically is just follow up one-to-one with all the people that ask questions that we didn't get round to answering. So if you think it's too off-piste, maybe just go and answer that question individually. And then maybe in your next newsletter that you send out to the audience after the event, you can just say, here's a list of all the questions that we didn't get round to answering, and here's all the answers that we gave, so that everyone can benefit from the answer. So another question here, next top voted one. Peter says that he missed the second webinar in the series. Is it available to watch somewhere? I think Charlie's already put a link in the chat. So yes, there is a landing page with all, well, soon to be 3 of the webinars that have been done so far with all the recordings. And then you can also sign up for the 4th one there. And Kim's podcast is also at the very bottom of that landing page as well. So if you missed the previous ones, please go and take a look there, and we'll also distribute them by email afterwards as well. So thank you for your interest, Peter, in the previous ones as well. That's great. So Natalie says, what about people who view the webinar on demand afterwards? So I think that question is probably angled at like, how do you deal with those people from a lead generation perspective? Well, that's what I would take from it anyway. So let me phrase that up then for Sonia. So Sonia, people that didn't see it live, but they watch it on demand, how do you sort of capture their intent, and how do you make sure that you cater for those people as well, and that you follow up with those people in
good? Interesting, because you probably then will collect a little bit less intent data that you would typically get in the polls. But if and you guys do the survey during the webinar, so you miss out on those. But if we look at your funnel, I would just kind of treat them as a marketing qualified lead, because they did go in, they did watch it, right? So just treat them like you treat those leads in the funnel. I would definitely reach out, because they're definitely a qualified lead.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I would treat them as marketing qualified lead, although I would add one thing. So the way that Atomley surveys works, so it's on the screen right now, that QR code in the bottom corner, we actually keep that QR code open for about a month or 2, or as long as the campaign would run for. So actually, Natalie, if you're using a software like this, all you need to do is just keep the tools open so that more submissions can be made after the live date. And then Atomley, automated system, Atomley sends me an email every time someone fills in the survey after the close date of the webinar. So then I get notified, I can go in, I can look at their responses, and I can follow up with them. So actually, people can be moved towards an Atomley qualified lead on demand as well. There's a big trend at the moment towards what they call simulive webinars, which is where you kind of pre-record a section of the webinar that is then played every day at 5 o'clock, for example. So if I register on any given day, there will always be a webinar that's around the corner that I can go and attend. So it's fake live, what I call fake live. They also work as long as the engagement piece of the webinar is done live. So you can have the pre-recorded piece simulive, and then when it goes to Q&A, the stream almost flips across to a live representative of the host's company, supplying company. And they are actually answering genuine live questions in that particular session. That works well. So if you're looking at doing simulive come and have a chat with us, because we've done a few projects around Simulive as well, and it does work. It takes a little bit more maintenance, but if you've got a really comprehensive strategy in place, Simulive works really well. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. I'll just do one more. Do you think webinars are more suitable for particular job seniorities? Do you think that there's a seniority above which where people don't attend? That's a great question, by the way. I've got a point of view on that. So Sonia, I'll let you go first, and then I'll chime in afterwards.
It's a very good question. It's a very, very good question. And I'm really interested in your point of view, because I do know you very well, but I don't know that. I think there's a golden middle somewhere. So there's too junior because there's no budget or power behind their seniority level. Maybe there's a soft recommendation power, but that would be it. And then there's too senior, where everything's delegated. I mean, the CEO of Mondelez or any other like multi-billion corporation is not going to come to a webinar, and they also do not make the appropriate decisions that would be to kind of like to which platform they use for a webinar. So there is a healthy middle somewhere, and that's where you want to look, not too junior, not too senior.
Yes, completely agree. So here's my 2 cents on it. We've actually been working a lot on this recently, because obviously people are trying to target C-level, director level executives within businesses. And exactly what Sonia just said, typically in a larger business, once you get up into the sort of mid-market and enterprise space, those people will not be coming along to webinars because they've already got 17 meetings in the day that they have to deal with. So what we do is we take a bit of a bottoms up and tops down approach. So we run webinars for our clients that are targeted at what we call the -1s and -2s. So when you're targeting that kind of enterprise or upper mid-market space, companies with 8-figure turnover annually, then what you want to do is look at like the people that report into the person that you're trying to target, or maybe even 2 levels down from that person. Invite those people to this format of webinar, like a mass attendance webinar. And part of the request that you have of them is to ask for their support in promoting within the business your product or service, right? And if you can win the trust of enough of those people, what we would call champions in a sort of classic sales textbook, then you will be able to internally promote up, and you'll be able to get up into the -1s and into the C level. What we also do as the tops down approach is then to run in-person or very bespoke virtual events. So if you go back to the very first event that we did about a month ago with Tom from DataSpark, he ran a wine tasting webinar. There was only about 25, 30 people attending. They were all C-level executives. He sent them a box of wine and cheese, and it was a longer format, more discussion-based roundtable, where they would stop in between each topic and they would have a sommelier with the wine and the cheese. And so it's a much more bespoke event. So you can either pair up a mass attendance webinar for the sort of mid management people, and then you can have a more bespoke in-person or virtual roundtable event for the senior people. And if you target them both in parallel, then as the people in the business are talking about what you're doing, hopefully that reaches the C-level person, and then they receive an invite, and it's like, oh, I already know what this company is because my team's been talking about it for the last few weeks. So that's a strategy that works. Sorry, that was a really long answer, but hopefully useful. Okay, we're coming up to the time. There's one last question, which is a really quick answer. What is the optimal time of day to run a webinar? There's a really great piece of research which I will circulate after, but I think it's from Get Response, where they did like they analyzed like 10,000 webinars or something last year, and they looked at all of the dates and times and the attendee numbers and things like that. So we'll circulate that afterwards, because it is important to choose the right date and time so that people are actually available to turn up. Okay, cool. Right, it's 4:00. People have got other meetings to go to, I'm sure. Thank you, Sonia, first of all, for joining me and answering the questions and having an input on that. Really great to speak to you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you need any advice or support on webinars in general, or if you want to try out the Atomley software, which is the thermometer that's on the screen right now, let us know. If you're planning to run events, webinars, and you're not sure where to start, also let us know. We can help with that as well. And yeah, final thing, we'll distribute the recording so that you can share it with your colleagues. And if you have any questions, just send us an email. So thank you all for attending. Thanks again, Sonia. And we'll see you in a few weeks for the 4th webinar, which is on the 13th of July.
Amazing. Looking forward to it. Thanks, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you, Sonia. Catch you later.
Bye.